This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today on the show, I have Megan McArdle. Her book, The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. We cover a lot of territory today. From my two black eyes as a teenager, to the start of KFC, to Van Halen, to why there's no more monkey bars. A society of you-know-what. But the key is to fail well. Not just to fail well and stop there, but to fail well and come back, to take the iterative step to get back in the game. But you're going to fail. If you don't think you're going to fail, you're going to fail. Megan brings great wisdom. I hope you enjoy. I thought a great place to start would be the idea of trophy kids. And as you describe it, no winners, no losers, no scrubs, no MVPs, and no high monkey bars on any playgrounds at all anymore.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's actually evidence from research that taking down the high monkey bars can stunt kids' development. They can actually end up more afraid of heights than if they'd climbed up and had a fall. They can end up not, wanting to explore when they get later on in life. But we're so terrified about letting our kids fall that we've ended up depriving them of the most important lesson that they're going to learn as kids, which is how to take a fall, how to take some risks, how to climb higher, and when you fall, how to pick yourself up again and move on. And I think that's a metaphor for a lot of what we're doing to kids in everything from team sports to college admissions.
When I used to ride a dirt bike, just a pedal dirt bike when I was a kid, there was no helmets. If you wore a helmet, you probably got beat up. But I've still got a scar on my chin where I think I got 30 stitches and knocked pieces of bone off my chin. But I don't know. I think I learned something from that. There's no guarantee the helmet's going to necessarily solve everything.
Yeah, I still have the scar on my forehead from where I got hit in the head with a swing. But you know what? I wouldn't trade having gotten on the swings and the experience of soaring into the air for a little less scar on my forehead. And I think when you talk to people who've had experiences like that and more traumatic experiences with school and other things, very few of them say, gosh, I really wish that I'd been wrapped in bubble wrap and nothing bad had ever happened and nothing good either.
So I was thinking about something that happened to me in the last year. I recognized somebody that I connected with in Facebook. I recognized the name and I Googled him and I realized that there's a very famous investor in the last 30 years named Julian Robertson. And he had something called the Tiger Cubs. These were people he trained and they all became multi-billion-dollar hedge fund managers. Well, one of the guys that I grew up with playing baseball became one of these guys, but he was terrible in baseball. He was the right fielder that struck out every game. And I wrote him an email and I said, hey, did we play baseball together as kids and you were like the worst player on the team? And he's like, yep, that was me. And I was like, well, it all turned out all right, didn't it?
Exactly. I went to a high school that basically had mandatory athletics, and I am not a good athlete at all. I'm slow. I can't jump. The only thing I'm 6'2", so I'm good at being tall. But other than that, I'm basically hopeless at sports. And yet, I think about this. It was like a little bit humiliating that I would get put in to get the tip off and then taken out and benched for the rest of the game. But I also learned an enormous amount, first of all, about getting better at things that I'm not particularly good at. And that's actually hugely important. If you think about, we tend to focus in our careers on the things that we are good at. We tend to focus on practicing and going into the areas where we excel. But then you get to kind of the big leagues and you realize, one of the really important things I have to do for my career is get better at stuff where I actually don't have skills, because no one is skilled at everything. So, I'm a pretty good writer, but I don't like managing. So that's something that over time, as I've had to do more teamwork, mentor more junior people, that I have to get better at that, even though it's not my favorite thing to do and it's not necessarily a personal strength. The experience of getting onto the basketball court and practicing and practicing and practicing and not improving as fast as my teammates, but still improving, was incredibly valuable. And I worry that often we're depriving kids of experiences like that by encouraging them not to do anything that feels bad.
Yeah, I still remember I was cut on the baseball team my freshman year, and I was MVP the second year. So you just got to stick with things. But, listen, forget about the kids for a second. This idea of a regulator out there to guarantee our perfect safety has extended way past kids and monkey bars. It's at all aspects of society, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And you think about, I went on a zip line when I was on vacation in St. Martin, and the most remarkable thing to me was just how easy the whole experience was. There was no, signing elaborate releases and so forth. And what I realized is that couldn't happen in America anymore, because we're so obsessed with safety that often we're not doing things. There's all sorts of products and activities that are getting harder and harder to do simply because the liability is too much. And that's a real shame, because we're missing out on things that we would really enjoy if we were allowed to do them.
Yeah, it is terribly frustrating. Let me shift gears around. Your book goes into a lot of different areas. It's an interesting thread how you take the reader through. But let me go to someone who came up in your book quite a bit. And he's actually appeared on my podcast. He's a very smart guy, happened to have won a Nobel Prize, and that's Vernon Smith. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you learned from Vernon Smith?
Oh, well, an immense amount. It's hard to pick out just a few things, but
you like that open-ended question for.
Yes, exactly. So the first thing I would point out is just what you learn is the power of experimentation. And this is something that, we like to think in our lives and in business and in research, that what we really need to do is sit down and think and get everything perfect and really, get an excellent plan, and that then the rest should just take care of itself. But in fact, I was just talking to, Jeff Science, the guy who rescued, healthcare.gov yesterday, and he said, in business, the companies that make it, it's not the companies that have the best strategic plan, it's the companies that execute. Bear with me, this actually is going somewhere, which is that, when you talk to Vernon Smith, when you talk to Bart Wilson, who works with him in his lab at Chapman University, what you learn about is the power of experimentation to show you results that you weren't expecting. And the problem with just sitting around and getting a good plan and modeling is that the stuff that you never would have imagined gets dropped out. And so you lose that. And the most interesting thing that I heard over and over again at Vernon Smith's lab was people saying, the biggest thing is just people surprise you. Like, you think, well, this is irrational and no one would do this. And then a bunch of people do it, and you have to sit down and say, okay, why? What's going on here? What am I missing? And if you were just sitting around and trying to model kind of perfectly rational agent, or even if you were trying to pull an empirical, out of data, you might miss it because you wouldn't be expecting it. You wouldn't be looking for it. And that's the amazing power of experimentation. And then, beyond that, what I learned about specific experiments was just fascinating in terms of everything from hunter-gatherers to how we handle money. They've done so much amazing research. They've done research on stock market bubbles. And here's an interesting finding. They actually see stock market bubbles. They can produce them in the lab. When they do asset price markets, they get them. And so, again, it points to these things that, if you were just looking at the empirical data, we get so few stock market bubbles that you might say, oh, well, maybe the data's wrong. I can't really see whether this is true or not. But you put it in the lab, and it's just super powerful.
Let me see if you share the same experience as myself. And I've met Vernon before, too. It's amazing for a man who's over 80 years of age, he might as well be a teenager with the way he approaches life and his thinking and his openness.
Yes, absolutely. He's still going. He's just still doing work and still when the rest of us would be like, okay, I've done enough.
Well, there's some issues I'm sure that came up in his work too, but one of the big things that came out, and you've kind of hinted at this already in what you're saying, but the idea of learning in crisis, a good crisis, and I know this as an entrepreneur, a good crisis, that's what hardens you. That's where you learn. You have to have something go wrong to learn the lesson, to see the opportunity. And you're mentioning that within Vernon's lab, but a crisis is terribly important, isn't it?
Oh gosh, absolutely. I mean, so first of all, failure, it does two things, right? First of all, it's an amazing way to learn. It is how we learn. But also, failure kind of sweeps away things that aren't working. It makes it plain so that you can't ignore it anymore. And we all like to, because failure feels bad, as it has to, because if failure didn't feel bad, we would not stop doing whatever it is that we're doing. So, there's a tendency to kind of deny and to say, well, maybe I can make this work out and so forth. Failure stops that process. And in the process of that, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, says it created destruction. When things fail, when we have that, it clears the decks for things that are even better. Unfortunately, it can be a very painful process for those who are involved, but it's also a process of creation and renewal. And we tend to forget that when we're in the middle of this, that, hey, this isn't just about feeling bad. This is actually something it's going somewhere. I'm changing and learning right now if I am willing to actually take stock and learn those lessons and then make a plan for moving on with the lessons that I have learned.
I always say for my MBA program, I didn't learn much, but I did learn the definition of a sunk cost. And I think when you combine a sunk cost with the idea of not blaming either other people or yourself for failure, it's a lot, as you're saying, just clear the decks and move forward. But I think the idea of a sunk cost and looking to blame people for failure and living in the past and skipping the moment of right now is terribly difficult for a large part of the population.
Oh, sure. I think it's hard for everyone. There are people who are better at it than worse at it. Even the people who are good at it, they need to be conscious about it too. It's not an easy process for anyone. And I will say, and it's absolutely right. It's one of the things I took away from my MBA program. The other thing I took away from my MBA program was a different way of looking at things. Normally you look at a business model and you think, does this story sound convincing to me? Or, a policy study or whatever it is. And what I actually took away, to go back to Vernon Smith for a second, is I took away, instead of looking at it and saying, does this feel true to me? Asking myself, okay, what would make this not be true? What piece of evidence would tell me that this was false? And then go look for that piece of evidence. It's a different way of thinking, and it's incredibly clarifying. And I think that's probably the most valuable thing that I personally took out of my program.
There's I'm kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but there's such a fun example in your book, and you can put it in context. Van Halen, errors, and M&Ms.
Yeah.
Great story.
So, yes, this is an amazing story. So Van Halen was sort of long renowned as these incredible prima donnas because they would demand in their dressing room, in every contract, they had a line that said, we want a huge bowl of M&Ms in our dressing room and no brown M&Ms. If there are any brown M&Ms, we're walking off, the contract void. And for the longest time, this was given as an example of just what princesses they all were. And then one of the people in the band actually published a book, and he said, no, you completely misunderstood what we were doing. The thing was that their setup was incredibly complicated. They had this pyrotechnics and lights and so forth.
It was like 20 trucks of gear compared to 3 trucks of gear for like other bands.
Yeah, just amazing amounts of gear. And what they said was, look, if this wasn't set up correctly, someone could get killed or hurt, including us. And so what they did was they had this incredibly lengthy contract that specified exactly how every light had to be set up, every piece of equipment. And in the middle of this contract, it would be like clause, 124, brown M&Ms. And so when they walked into the dressing room, it was actually a really sophisticated test for what in the book I talk about is normative error, which is someone is not committed to the process of getting it right. So what they would do is they would walk into the dressing room, and as soon as they saw it, they would look for the bowl of M&Ms. If they didn't see it, or if there were brown M&Ms, they would walk out because they would immediately know something that these guys were not careful, they had not been paying close attention to the contract, and that therefore they had to go and recheck everything because guaranteed something wasn't done right. And he said, and it was absolutely true. Every single time that they gotten the M&Ms wrong, we went and checked something, and they'd screwed something up.
They buried that rider like in the middle of like 30 pages of contract.
Exactly. It was really buried, and that was to make sure that they were dealing with people who were reading every single clause of the contract instead of skimming.
So now you know I read the book, huh?
Exactly, because this comes towards the end and it's buried away. This is a really powerful test, and you think about this. I wouldn't recommend this exact strategy, but it's actually you do want to in your own life pay close attention to those things. Is you need to be checking how are we doing and how committed are we to getting this right. And I talk about in the book different ways that you can try to bring in, failure checks and looking and checking kind of continually, early and often, are we doing this right? Do we need to reconsider or maybe do something different?
One of the things you stress in the book, which a lot of people talk about these days, but it never gets old, which is the idea of small manageable risks. You don't want to blow up on one bet. And, in dovetailing also back into a little bit with Vernon's ideas, which is the idea of experimentation. Of course, you have to try, you have to execute, as you say. Then you have to realize that you're going to have to take iterations after that. So it's going to be constant little steps. And I thought was so interesting what you do effectively in the book is then you would bring it back to a story, for example, like the father going to the nursery school in the Upper East West Side of New York City with a 2-year-old, and they're asking him what his 2-year-old's aspirations are. And I think his comment was something to the effect of, we're trying to teach her not to eat gum off the street or something.
Yes, exactly. For the full effect, you have to hear it in his thick Long Island accent, which was like, what are her aspirations? It was really... But that, getting away from just pointing out that they've taken monkey bars away, but what's happened to a certain segment of the adult population that some headmistress at that school thought this was an appropriate direction for the school to go, that they actually think this is the way to, I guess it's what you call wiffle parenting, and to some degree, isn't that what we're Yes. People have gone insane. And, I talk to my friends who have kids about this. They sort of agree it's insane, but they also feel like they can't stop. And, I grew up in New York when New York was really dangerous in the 1970s and 1980s, which is sort of the bottom of the urban New York experience. And the funny thing is, like my friends and my best friend got on the bus to go across the crosstown bus by herself. Now, her mom walked her to the bus stop and so forth, but she rode this bus by herself in first grade. My sister rode the subway to school when she was 9, all the way from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to Brooklyn. I walked past housing projects in a group of, 4th graders by ourselves. And I talk to people now who I grew up with who they couldn't possibly let their 13-year-old daughter, be home alone or go to school by herself. And you would think from talking to them that the attrition rate in our generation had been at least like 30%. But as far as I know, we all lived through this. So there's this, and the thing is the parents don't like it. They hate it. They complain constantly about how difficult it is to have to spend all of this time ferrying your kids around and how the kids don't have any freedom and they don't get any exercise and all of this. So it's not that people are enjoying this. This is the strange thing to me, is that somehow we're doing it even though every single person who's participating complains about it. And I think, when you talk to people, what you see is that they feel like they don't have any choice, because there's a couple of things going on. The first is that in any group of parents, the rules about what is safe, what is considered safe to let your kids do, are set by the craziest parent. So the most insanely overprotective parent is the one who decides what we're going to let our kids do. So that's a big part of it. It's just that because the problem is, if anything happened and you were doing something different from the other parents, you would want to kill yourself, right? You would never get over the regret. And so you tend to take cues from what other people are doing, and that's just creating this safety ratchet. But the other part of it is that people, well, actually there's 3 parts. The second part is that people get all of this from the news, is that they see kids getting abducted or so forth, and like, the odds of your child getting abducted are considerably lower than the odds of your child getting into a car accident while you're taking them to school. But we don't see that. That doesn't feel nearly as real as what we saw in the news, which is that there's all these children being abducted. The third thing is the college ratchet, is that it now feels like it is so hard to make sure that your kids have a decent job when they grow up. You have to basically wrap them in bubble wrap, micromanage their lives, spend every moment from the age of, 1 to the age of 20, making sure that they cannot possibly make a false step. And I compare that to my own high school experience, where when I got into trouble with teachers, my parents just said, you should not do that. That's a bad idea. That's really too bad. You should figure out how to make your teachers like you again. And that is inconceivable today because the stakes are so high. So part of it is that we have raised the stakes on childhood, not because the world is more dangerous. It isn't. But because we feel it's more dangerous.
Well, the unfortunate part, too, and I was thinking about this as I was reading your book, is there's an author out there that I appreciate, a guy named Seth Godin. And Seth is pretty much in this linchpin mindset where he's like, look, technology is changing things. It's arbing away the need for human capital. And perhaps your best bet in the environment that we're in is to kind of look at the tools we have, the internet, how easy it is to start a business, an informational business, and go to town, start something. And I think it's very, as we're talking about the idea of failing, how in the world a parent thinks that they can make all of these steps for their children, and then they get to the, 22, 23 years of age, and unless a job from the man is not there, then once again, it's a failure. The whole process is messed up because we don't really, in the school system, and I'm curious your opinion, we really don't effectively give people the idea of, hey, you know what? You might not get a job. You might create your own job. And I think that's something we all need to think about.
Everyone is looking for a guarantee, right? Everyone wants to basically guarantee that it is not possible for their kid to have anything go wrong. And and we romanticize, it used to be this way, it used to be easy, it used to be. And none of this is true. My grandfather was a small businessman. And, he started a job. It was the Great Depression. He worked as a grocery boy until he was 26. It wasn't romantic at all. And then he built a great business and nearly lost it because then he owned a gas station in the New York State Thruway, changed the location of, they built a new thruway and it bypassed his gas station, which had previously been on the major highway. And we romanticize, the previous generation, it was so easy for them, they didn't have all of these challenges. This is completely untrue. There's a small minority of people who had these jobs where you couldn't get fired and all you had to do was show up for 30 years and they gave you a gold watch. That was never the case for the majority of Americans. It wasn't the case for entrepreneurs. It wasn't the case for African Americans. It wasn't the case for women. This was something for a very small fraction of basically, white males in certain jobs. And yet we romanticize it because a lot of the people who are writing about it were raised by these professional couples. So it seems like that was the way it always was for everyone. And in fact, the world has always been risky. And that doesn't mean that it's impossible to have a decent life and we all just have to sit around in the dark and wail about how everything has gone to hell. In fact, lots of people in the 19th century, lots of people in the 20th century who didn't have a guaranteed job and could get fired and had to struggle the way my grandfather did for a long time, nonetheless managed to live very good lives and raise kids and, not die in horrible penury. But we've forgotten it because we started to think of this very abnormal period that applied to a very small number of people as being somehow a birthright that we're all entitled to. And in fact, the funny thing is, when you read the literature of that era, when you read books and so forth, everyone's complaining about how boring it is.
Yeah. Yeah, we won't go there, but I just sometimes think in my own mind that the dot-com bubble coupled with 9/11 just spun off an immense amount of fear that is with us to this day. I just really despise that fear that spun off from those events because it was fleeting, it was temporary. There was no reason to, change the direction of the country. But Unfortunately, we did. Let me let you go. I have two things I want to run by with you really quick. One, I want you to tell an inspirational story for my last issue, but I want you to explain a big picture issue that you bring up in the book, which is the idea of forager morality versus farmer morality. I was trying to guess your politics in the middle of this, and it's kind of hard because at one point in time I think, okay, she's going this way, and I'm like, oh no, she's going this way, and then I'm like, oh, she's kind of in the middle. So why don't you explain forager morality versus farmer morality?
So this was one of the most interesting things that I learned from Vernon Smith was while I was there, this was totally serendipitous. I had not been expecting to learn about this, but while I was at his lab, I got the opportunity to talk to an anthropologist that they were doing work with. We talked about their research on risk and how we share. So this is really interesting, is that you think of hunter-gatherers are presumably we think the stage that we passed through after we evolved, from our common ancestor with chimpanzees. And chimpanzees are not good at sharing at all. They're not good at cooperating. They can, but they're not good at it. It tends to fall apart pretty quickly. And yet, foragers are among the most sharing human cultures. They are sort of radical redistributionists, and it varies by forager group, but all of them share more than, say, modern Americans do. And what's interesting about this is that
the reason they're sharing.
Exactly. So Kaplan, who was the anthropologist who's working with them, says this is actually a totally rational response to events. So if you think about how, say, you're an Eskimo hunting a seal, and you sit down by an air hole in the ice, and you wait for a seal. You can be the best hunter in the entire world, but if a seal doesn't show up, you are not going to eat today. Kaplan's point is that, what we think of as, just sort of straight moral propositions are actually situational. That in some situations, because here's the interesting thing, when people move to farming, they change. And he actually witnessed this. So he actually worked with a very strong sharing tribe in Paraguay known as the Ache. He witnessed their transition to agriculture. And what happened when they transitioned to agriculture was that they went from being radical sharers. They actually had a norm. Men were not allowed to eat from their own kill because they told them it would make them lose their ability to hunt. So they shifted from this to being more like, property rights folks. I mean, they tried collective farming when they switched and it didn't work. It failed for the same reason that it failed in the Plymouth colony and failed in Russia. And so what he says is, look, when you are in a situation where you could hunt and you could get nothing, not because you didn't work hard, but just terrible bad luck. And on the other hand, your friend may get thousands of calories more than he can eat because he got lucky today. It makes rational sense to redistribute. When there's a linear connection between the amount of hard work you put in and the output, and when you can save and store food, then you don't need that insurance policy. Then instead, you end up with property rights because the incentive problem starts to matter a lot more. And this is a really tremendous insight to me that your situation is going to determine how much you share, with whom you share, how much you rely on property rights. And this matters a lot because, if you look at modern political debates, I think that you can really think about most of them as a disagreement over whether we are more like farmers or more like foragers. So to see what I mean, think about, welfare. Is if you think that economics is mostly luck, then you are probably going to want there to be a pretty robust safety net. If you think that is paid for by the people who have more. If you think that economics is mostly hard work, and that there's this linear relationship between input and output, then you're probably going to want there to be less redistribution and more incentives for production. And this translates into basically every political argument we have, is that it boils down to, are we listening to our farmer instincts or our forager instincts? Because we have both. And in an entrepreneurial economy, one of the things that you really have to recognize, and Americans are good at recognizing this and other countries aren't so good at it, is that you're taking risks, and that's valuable hard work, but that a lot of the time, no matter how hard you work or how smart you are, it's not going to work out. And that therefore you really have to think about rewarding the risk taking rather than trying to reward the outcome per se, or at least making it cheaper to fail.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've never seen that kind of connection, the foraging and versus the farming. I thought it was fascinating. I think you're exactly right that you really can look at the political debates. It doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't make those political debates any easier, but it definitely gives you a way to frame them and see where people are coming from. Hey, let me let you end with a fun story, which I think goes straight to the heart of failure, goes to sticking with it. And for everybody that thinks, because they saw one story of Mark Zuckerberg making, I don't know how many billions by the ages of 28, and I don't know how many Zuckerbergs there are out there, not many people. So why don't you tell the fun story? And I'm currently in Asia right now, and they love their KFC over here. I'm telling you, there's a KFC everywhere in Asia. I don't know how it happened, but they got the head start on getting fast food into Asia. So why don't you tell the KFC story? And I think it's fun.
This is one of my favorite stories because it really goes to, I get so many calls and emails from people who say, well, this is all fine if you're 26, but what if, I'm 55 and I've been laid off and what do I do? And I don't want to minimize that. I was laid off for 2 years. It's terrible. It's really, I talk about this in the book. It's not that I'm in any way minimizing the misery, but I think that there's, don't give up is the lesson of this. So Colonel Sanders was a serial screw-up. He was so much of a serial screw-up. His wife actually left him because she was sick of the get-rich-quick schemes and the jobs that didn't pan out and so forth. And he finally kind of got it together when he was in his 40s. And he gets a little truck stop. And then his truck stop has exactly the same thing that happened to my grandfather's gas station happened to him, which was that the state of Kentucky built a new road and it bypassed his truck stop, and suddenly his business didn't really exist anymore. And I think a lot of you, he was 65 when this happened. And a lot of people would have just said, oh, well, that's it. It's over. And he didn't. He picked up, took a pressure cooker, went on the road, went to conventions, went to restaurants, and he just kept asking entrepreneurs, let me cook you some chicken, and if you will give me 5 cents of chicken, I will show you how to cook the best fried chicken you've ever had. And he propositioned a lot of people before someone said yes. But he only needed one. At the age of 65, he managed to resurrect his business into what we now know as Kentucky Fried Chicken. And had that failure not happened, had he not had this completely traumatic losing of his restaurant, he would have died as the proponent, as the owner of a modestly successful truck stop in Kentucky, and instead he struck it rich. So, this is not to say that every single person is going to have the same thing happen, but just to say that, it isn't, don't say, oh, well, I'm older and therefore it's obviously hopeless or I give up. But there are people, lots of people, who have really rebuilt their lives long after you would think it shouldn't have been possible. And so it's one of my favorite stories just because it is that message of, it's not just about 22-year-olds. This is for all ages.
Hey, was there anything today that your book is dense. There's a lot of different topics. There's a lot of insights in there. People are going to have to read it. But was there anything that I was not wise enough to ask tonight that you feel is terribly important for the audience to know? Maybe we kind of touched on a lot of the main points that people just have to dig in.
I think the main thing is that I hope that people will take from this book is honestly just being able to say to themselves, I'm not a failure, I'm someone who's failed. Just like basically every other successful person in history. You look in the basement of any successful, and name anyone you admire, I guarantee that I can come up with stories of hideous, horrible failures that left them miserable and convinced that their lives were over. There's a great story about Julius Caesar, who's in Spain, comes in when he's around 40, comes across a statue of Alexander the Great and just gets completely hysterical, and his men are all, Caesar, why are you so sad? And he says, look at what he accomplished, and I'm basically just a loser. I'm a total failure. Nothing. I'm never going to amount to anything. He became the emperor of Rome. Everyone goes through that feeling when something bad happens, but in fact, every great person has had terrible failures in their life, and it isn't just that oh, you can fail and still go on to succeed, is that often those failures were the making of them. That had it not been for those black moments that we all have, that they would not have gone on to the success they eventually enjoyed. So I really want people to walk away and say, oh, okay, failure, it happens. You know, this is something that happens to me. It happened to Theodore Roosevelt. It happened to Julius Caesar. And to be able to walk away from that sort of looking for the next thing rather than thinking that this is preparing for the end.
I'm still very proud of the fact that I got into a fight when I was a teenager and I had 2 black eyes. So the book is The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. Megan McArdle. Hey, Megan, where's the best place for people to check you out? Website, Twitter? Where would you like people to go to?
I write for Bloomberg every day. I tweet at Asymmetric Info. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. There's a lot of great places to catch me on the web and social media.
Sounds good. Hey, Megan, I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.